We are diving headfirst into one of the most powerful and, let's face it, perpetually argued concepts in human thought: equality.
It's a word everyone uses.
Everyone, every political movement, every legal reform, it all seems to hinge on this single idea. But what are we actually defining philosophically when we say equality?
Well, that's the core tension, isn't it? Our book, which is this fantastic analysis using an Adlerian critique, makes it clear we're not talking about one concept.
No.
We're talking about two distinct, often conflicting ideas that were born right at the very start of Western philosophy.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to trace those two paths. You've got Plato's ideal on one side and Aristotle's practical approach on the other.
And we'll see how they've been reconciled, repurposed.
And are still driving debates today. If you want to understand the deep structure of what fairness even means, this is for you. We're aiming to give you that clarity.
And it is vital to see that duality. Recognizing that the entire Western discourse starts from these two co-equal origins is the key to unlocking everything that follows.
Before we jump into those origins, just a quick note. You are experiencing a unique two-voice AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis. Seuss! Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to start with the idealist, Plato. The book defines his approach as metaphysical and transcendent. Now, that sounds pretty esoteric. What does that mean for us, that the first big definition of equality actually placed it outside of our reality?
It means that for Plato, true equality isn't something you can find here in the physical world. It exists in an ideal realm.
The realm of the forms.
Exactly, the forms. It's perfect, unchanging, and totally separate from this flawed world we inhabit. His core claim is that every human soul is equal before the ultimate good.
So, are material differences, rich, poor, powerful, weak, those don't matter in this view?
They're temporary earthly illusions. They don't touch the real, eternal value of the soul.
Okay, but if equality is all about some internal spiritual status, how can we ever hold a government accountable for unequal treatment here on Earth? Doesn't that make the concept a little useless for politics?
Not useless, but it's secondary to a higher ideal for him, which is justice.
Ah.
For Plato, justice means everyone fulfilled the role they are naturally suited for. The whole system is designed for the harmony of the city-state. Equality is that baseline truth about the soul, but it has to be tempered by function.
So if my role is to be a laborer, and I do that well,
Then you are just as important in a cosmic sense as the philosopher king who is fulfilling his role. It's about the health of the whole, not about individual rights as we think of them.
Okay, now let's pivot shortly to Aristotle. He takes this and just brings it crashing back down to reality.
A completely different approach.
The book calls his philosophy teleological and immanent. Let's break that down.
Sure. When we say teleological, we mean he's focused on the end purpose, the telos of things.
The goal.
The goal. He wants to know how society functions to achieve the good life. So his idea of equality is entirely practical. It's rooted not in some ideal soul, but in the nature and function of people inside the city-state.
And this is where we get that classic definition of equality as proportionality, which I think is probably the most misunderstood part of this whole conversation.
Absolutely. For Aristotle, equality is applied through what he calls distributive justice. It's the idea that you should treat people equally if they are equal in merit or contribution that's relevant to the goal.
So give us an example.
Okay, think of a race. If you're distributing prize money, the winner and the person who came in last contributed unequally to the outcome of winning.
Right.
So treating them equally, giving them the same prize, would actually be profoundly unjust. The just thing is to treat them proportionally to their merit.
That just makes the tension crystal clear. We start the entire Western tradition with this deep philosophical friction. Is equality an ideal universal state of the soul, like Plato says, or is it a proportional, earned, functional tool of justice, like Aristotle says?
And that tension is baked into everything that comes after. It's the difference between saying all people are inherently equal and saying all people deserve equal treatment under certain circumstances.
So how did the next major philosophical era, the medieval period, deal with this? This is a huge contradiction. Did they just pick a side?
For the most part, no. They attempted a really masterful theological reconciliation. Thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas, they blended both classical paths.
How did they manage that?
Well, they used Platonic metaphysics to establish the baseline of humanity. All souls are equal before God. That sets up the transcendent universal equality.
So God's divine order basically steps in for Plato's form of the good.
Precisely. But then They brought in Aristotle's practical reason to manage society here on Earth. Social justice could remain proportional, reflecting a functional hierarchy.
And that hierarchy was justified by...
By natural law, which they saw as God's plan for the world. So they created this unified theory where equality was universal in its essence, but proportional in its social application. They kept both ideas alive under one big spiritual roof.
That synthesis sounds incredibly powerful. It holds that dual origin in a kind of balance for centuries.
It's a remarkable intellectual achievement.
Yeah.
But it's also inherently fragile once it gets challenged.
Let's pause right there before we get to the Enlightenment and see that synthesis start to shatter. Remember, you can find more in-depth analytical insights on these foundational philosophical shifts on Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques inspiring reflection and rational thought. All right, the Enlightenment. This is where the focus shifts completely. We move away from divine order, from metaphysical truth.
And the whole question of equality gets put into the hands of the individual and the state they're creating.
It's a radical break. Philosophers like Locke and Rousseau, they weren't asking about the soul's relationship to God or the ideal function of the polis.
No, they were asking a different question. What rights does a person have just by nature, and how much power should they give up to a government to protect those rights?
So the emphasis moves from inherent nature or divine law to universal rights and the social contract.
The social contract. The idea that the state only exists to protect the freedoms we already have. The central shift is that you're defined not by your place in a divine plan, but by what legal rights you have simply by being human.
And that move laid the groundwork for modern democracy. Legal equality before the law became the main definition people worked with.
Right. It often pushed aside the pure Platonic ideal and heavily modified Aristotle's idea of merit.
This is fascinating because we've gone from a transcendent ideal to a practical proportion, and now we've landed on a kind of legally enforced universality. So what does all of this history mean for us today? The debate obviously hasn't stopped.
It hasn't. It's just become more complex because now all three of those definitions, ideal, proportional, and legal, are all in play at the same time.
Which is why it's so polarized.
Exactly. Modern perspectives, you see them in thinkers like John Rawls or Robert Nozick, are essentially trying to resolve that old classical tension, but now within the rules of democracy and capitalism.
They're arguing about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome.
That's the big one.
Let's break that down. When people today argue for equality of opportunity, they're really echoing Aristotle, aren't they? Focusing on merit and function.
They are. The idea is we all start the race at the same line, and the outcome should be proportional to effort. It's about setting fair rules for the competition.
But the demand for equality of outcome, that feels like it touches on that older Platonic sense of a universal pre-societal fairness.
It does. Think of Rawls' famous veil of ignorance, the idea that a just society is one you'd agree to join even if you didn't know your place in it.
That's a powerful echo of the soul's fundamental equality.
So much of modern debate is just a battle over which of these classical definitions should have priority now.
That historical background is crucial.
Yeah.
But the book doesn't just stop there. It gives us a really rigorous tool to evaluate all these claims, the Adlerian critique framework.
And that's what makes the text so useful. This framework maps any claim about equality to evidence, and that it classifies it according to Adler's hierarchy: opinion, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. This moves the debate away from pure rhetoric and towards actual rigor.
Can we walk through an example? Let's take a modern claim, something like taxing the rich at 90% is the fairest system. Where would that fall?
Well, if it's just presented as a feeling, a gut preference for redistribution, it's classified as opinion.
Okay.
If the person cites historical data and economic models showing that, in a specific context, that tax rate correlated with high growth, then it moves into knowledge. It's a verifiable fact about the past.
But knowledge isn't the same as understanding.
Not at all. Understanding is when you can explain why it worked or failed. Synthesizing economic theory, historical context, human psychology, you see the causal links, not just the correlation.
And the highest level, wisdom.
Wisdom is when you can apply that understanding ethically and practically across different situations, ensuring it actually achieves justice and upholds human dignity.
That framework is so useful. It forces a kind of philosophical discipline on the argument. And beyond that hierarchy, the critique applies 3 critical tests, right?
It does. First, coherence. Is the claim internally consistent? Second, correspondence. Does it match objective reality? And third, pragmatic validity? Does it actually work in practice? Or does it lead to destructive consequences?
So any serious policy claim about equality has to pass those tests.
It should, yes.
Which brings us to the ethical application. The framework has a kind of ultimate check on power.
It does. It uses the golden rule as an ethical firewall. Any judgment about equality has to uphold reciprocity and respect for human dignity. And it does this by asking one critical question of any proposed system.
Which is?
Would this principle be acceptable if you suddenly switched roles with someone else in the system? If the principle only benefits you from a position of power, it fails the ethical test instantly.
That role reversal test is a powerful tool for civic life, connecting all this philosophy back to us.
And finally, the civic implications are weighed against constitutional goals like justice, general welfare, and liberty. This ensures a balanced, historically proportionate, and ethically rigorous approach. You can't just maximize one thing, like equality of outcome, to the point that you completely destroy liberty.
This has been a really comprehensive deep dive, tracing their concept from Plato's transcendent forms all the way to a modern critical framework for policy. The main takeaway for you, the listener, is that the book structures these ideas by constantly weaving between the classical, medieval, and modern views.
Highlighting that continuity and divergence.
Exactly. The arguments you hear on the news today are, in many ways, just new versions of these very old philosophical battles.
Which really raises an important question. If we connect all this to the bigger picture, how many of our modern debates over equality, political, economic, social, could be instantly clarified or maybe even resolved if we just first agreed on which tier of that Adlerian hierarchy the core claim actually belongs to?
Is it opinion, knowledge, understanding,
or wisdom? Imagine achieving that clarity before the political commitment.
A brilliant final thought. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally. See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.